one of the things that my study of the so-called dark side of the internet has led me to is really the belief that the dominant discourse, which I referred to a little earlier in the West, with regards to the internet in China, is really missing the mark. I think it's really lacking in an appreciation of how the Chinese Communist Party sees the potential of the internet. Increasingly, I've noticed, however, that a number of commentators in America in particular have been offering mild critiques of the liberation technology thesis, that is, critiquing the idea that the internet is somehow inherently a democratizing force. I think that if you'd like to understand more about that, I would refer you to a very recent paper by Rebecca McKinnon, senior fellow at the Foundation for New America, I think now, formerly at Princeton, and an Open Society fellow. The paper's entitled Network Authoritarianism. It's a new concept that she's working on for a book, which basically builds on Manuel Castell's network society thesis, and arguing that the Chinese state has got remarkable potential to co-opt and adapt the internet to its own ends, and that the sense that the internet in China is simply going to lead to automatically to democracy and to greater levels of freedom of speech is somewhat misleading. I think one of the key points there, and perhaps worth mentioning here in the context of Fritt Ord, is that really to look at this problem, you have to look at this human rights framework as a whole. Something that I'm sure Sharon will be getting into in a little while. For me specifically, that means that I'm particularly interested in the relationship between, say, Article 19, freedom of expression, with that to the right to privacy, or free assembly. There's no point, in other words, in advocating for an increase in the level of people's ability to express their opinions if those opinions are then used to put them in prison for 11 years, or to invade their privacy through compromising, hacking their computer, and harvesting their social network, and so on. So in effect, you know, as I was saying when I mentioned McKinnon's paper, I essentially agree with her, subscribe to her notion of network authoritarianism in terms of the way in which my analysis of China is developing. I think, in fact, that we're seeing the emergence of what I might be tempted to call cybernetic Marxism. And I think that, as I mentioned, we're underestimating the party's ability to adapt the internet to its own ends. This can be seen in any number of ways. One very simple example which interests people is the phenomenon in China known as the 50 cents party. That is, individuals and networks of individuals who are paid by the party, you know, approximately 50 cents per opinion that they post on message forums, social media sites, and so on, which will support the opinion of the party. It's not just that there's censorship, it's not just that there's monitoring, surveillance, but that the state is actively engaged in shaping the internet environment in a very profound way. And I think that at a very high level, if you look at the Politburo, you'll see that, you know, any number of them are engineers or scientists or technocrats of some kind or another, which is, of course, in contrast to Western democracies where you won't find all that many engineers in parliaments. If you look at the internal narrative that the state has about the internet, and more generally about the way in which the country's governed, you'll see that probably from the early 90s, second-order cybernetic system engineering systems theory really dominated the way in which the intellectual elite thought about reform. So this is really the reformist part of the party that I'm talking about specifically here. And similarly at that time, there emerged a concept known as metasynthetic engineering, which is really China's version of complexity science or systems engineering, developed by a very famous and quite brilliant Chinese scientist called Chen Sen. And it's worth recounting a little bit of his story just to give you a sense of where this theory is coming from, and more to the point where it's going. Chen Sen went to the US to study on a scholarship and to Stanford, and proved himself to be absolutely incredible physicist, and became a core part of the programs which went on to become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Caltech and at Caltech, and found himself, unfortunately, during the McCarthy era, accused of being a communist spy, and was put under house arrest in LA, I think, for about 4 years. During which time, in fact, he wrote his first book on cybernetic theory, and eventually he was exchanged for a number of U.S. airmen who were being held after the Korean War, and returned to China, where he almost immediately met with Mao, who realized that in the mind of this scientist was the seeds for his ambitions to make China a nuclear power, and later make China a space power. So Chen set to work from scratch, of course, creating a nuclear program for China, mainly using the books that he brought back from his studies in America and the knowledge that was in his head from having worked so closely with the Pentagon and other parts of the US for so long. Then went on to basically lay foundations for the space program, which has been phenomenally successful in China, as we know. And he's mostly known for this. He's recognized by aerospace engineers as probably in the top 10. He was recognized as being in the top 10 contributors to the space age. But in later life, he turned his attentions much more to systems theory and second-order cybernetics. You'll find, for example, any number of his protégés involved in shaping Chinese policy. I guess one really notable example would be the population control policy, the one-child policy, which everyone here will have heard of. That has its origins in Chan's theories of cybernetics, and it was the first time, really, I think, that the Chinese leadership had ever seen a computer simulation, and it was the first time that they began to see the potential for applying cybernetics to their vision of how China should be run. There's a brilliant book written by a researcher at the University of Cambridge about the origins of the population control policy and its relationship to China's understanding of cybernetics, and that really gives you a sense that the unintended consequences, the side effects of these kind of theories taken out of the Western context, placed into a Chinese context and applied to human beings. We're not talking about guiding weapon systems, rockets. We're talking about humans as objects and guiding them as part of a system. The side effects are profound and could be argued quite negative if you look at the rates at which the disequilibrium in gender in China, for example, the number of male babies as opposed to female babies and so on, is obviously down the line going to lead to a very serious problem, coupled with an aging population. And anyway, I essentially what I'm seeing the work that I'm beginning right now in terms of exploring this cybernetic Marxism is that China is really heading in a direction that isn't what we would understand to be democratic. But when you see Liu Xiaobo or other senior leaders speaking about free speech and the need for democracy, in my terms, he's really talking about cybernetic Marxism, not democracy in the Western sense. So within metasynthetic engineering, essentially is the concept of the OCGS, the Open Complex Giant System. That's really how the Chinese state regards the internet, and indeed almost any other system, including the population and its relationship to the environment, another OCGS. And there's some really, really fascinating research being done within that framework by a growing number of scientists all over China, and to a lesser extent around the world. It's a concept which is popular in Japanese cybernetic circles in South Korea, but not really being explored much outside of that context, and not much in the English language, but there's some. I'm actually very surprised that over the years people studying the internet in China haven't referred to this literature in terms of trying to develop an understanding of how the Chinese state sees the direction that this technology is going in. There are a few papers which I noted, which I've been reading recently, which are directly relevant to what we're talking about here today, freedom of expression in China, and also serves to make the point that allowing greater freedom of expression without corresponding developments in other rights is quite hazardous, potentially. There's research which parallels this in the West. People may have heard of recent research into the relationship between, the correlation between people using Twitter and the movement of the NASDAQ, the stock exchange for technology companies in the United States. An incredible 87% correlation there. In other words, that these scientists were able to use techniques akin to metasynthetic engineering to predict where the stock exchange was going to go. Same thing is being done in China in terms of monitoring public opinion on the internet. There are systems being set in place to measure what the author refers to as the infection of different ideas, different memes, different sort of thought forms as they spread through the Chinese internet. So all very well, if the space for civil society to express itself and to dialogue with itself and with the state is increasing, which it is as a consequence of the spread of the internet, but at the same time, if the state then has a corresponding capacity to monitor more and more closely what is being said and who's saying it and how they're influencing other people, then that can lead to side effects like being able to identify and harvest social networks of dissidents, movements as they begin to emerge. So, in other words, if the corresponding right, in this case, the right to privacy, the right not to be surveyed in that kind of way by your government isn't respected, then freedom of expression on its own isn't going to lead to any significant change and could, in fact, lead to some unpleasant side effects.